Right, so I think we can get started. It's great to have you all here today, and it's great to be here. It's exciting to be kicking off this event. I'm Ethan Kleinberg. I'm a professor of history and letters at Wesleyan University, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the journal History and Theory. And it's really exciting to have people, well, from all sorts of places coming in, and then people who actually came in person, which is, I'm never quite sure whether people are going to show up in person anymore. That's become a very wobbly part of my existence. But I do want to start with some thank yous. Certainly I want to thank Amanda Anderson and the Kogut Institute for the Humanities and the History Department at Brown for their support, and especially Joe Mizell and the Brown University Library for supporting and hosting, crucially, this event. And then I also want to thank Allison Levy, Jennifer Braga, Dawn Sylvia, and Liz Boyle for doing what we'll call the heavy lifting in organizing the conference, getting everyone here, making this happen, and also Media Services and the Media Services team, because you need a lot of, well, technological wizardry to get a hybrid event off the ground. And hopefully, usually you walk into these things with a bit of trepidation because you never know what's going to happen when you have so much technological wizardry, but I guess that's part of our conversation over the next 2 days. So I'm going to start by making it clear that I'm no expert on digital history myself. But I have, however, been thinking about the digital for some time now, so it's not totally unfamiliar territory. About a decade ago, when I was the director of the Center for the Humanities at Wesleyan, I led a digital humanities initiative, and this served as an incubator for innovative projects in the humanities and social sciences. And during that time, I taught several seminars in the digital humanities, and I worked with students and faculty to create and implement digital history laboratories and projects. So I would call myself a professional enabler of the digital, if not a current practitioner, although I do have a project down the road, but we could talk about that in the reception or such. It's also the case that in my book, Haunting History for a Deconstructive Approach to the Past, I devoted a chapter called The Analog Ceiling to the restrictions of analog publishing, as well as to the potential for shifting to new modes of narrative, form, and research. So in that chapter, I argued that analog practices in publishing and academic production in general forced scholars into the sorts of linear narratives used in conventional history, which then in a kind of reciprocal feedback loop, reinforced a theory of history that aligned with those very linear narratives. In the book, I refer to this as ontological realism. And the part that was sort of surprising to me is that seemed to be almost always the case that these scholars would do so more so out of purposes of convenience rather than conviction. Actually, if you press them on either side of the equation, the theoretical side or the practical side, they seem to have no real stake in the game or no real sense of that, like, yeah, well, we know it doesn't really work that way, but that's the way it works. Well, in contrast, then and now, there are technologies available for research, production, writing, academic scholarship that really do provide incredible possibilities for different strategies for the writing of history, whether it's linear or nonlinear, for research, for presentation of research, for doing research, or even for thinking about what the past, in the case of history, might be. And I would argue that these actually, in turn, allow for multiple or multivocal narratives of history. And this then aligns, at least in my work, with what I've called a theory of history polyphonic and elsewhere multidimensional history. And I think you can see that already in some of the discussions in the theme issue, but also in works like Shahzad Bashir's recent Born Digital publication. And of course, and as you know, most recently, History and Theory published this December 2022 theme issue on the topic of digital history, in which we sought to take up recent trends and problems from multiple perspectives, and actually to try to bring together interlocutors who don't always traffic in the same circles. It turns out there are different people working on digital history and even may have different imaginations of what it is. And we thought, well, what if we bring a different sort of constellation together and get everybody in conversation? Some of the participants have worked together before, others haven't. Some probably worked together a while ago, as is in the case with our first panel. So this is a sort of backwards development, and at the prompting of Allison and Shahzad, we thought it would be exciting to bring the contributors to that theme issue together to move beyond the published work and attempt to think about where digital history can take us. So rather than use a conference as the means to construct a theme issue, we've used the theme issue as the starting point for this conference. Now, the subtitle of the theme issue is Changing Narratives, Changing Methods, Changing Narrators. And we've asked the presenters gathered here to extend the argument of their contribution to that issue, and really to do so in the most sort of forthright ways. Don't hold anything back. I mean, we'll see whether they do. So we really wanted them to think about the ways we can make change happen now in this realm. We asked them to imagine the most analytically and intellectually radical effects of digital methods, whether correlating between their work and other articles in the issue can lead to identifying overlaps or disagreements that push historical conceptualization into new directions. What are the resources needed to compel historians to think of digital methods as radical critique, for instance, rather than efficient storage and mapping? How can digital history as critique be institutionalized? Do we want it to? How might the reach of digital history be leveraged to intervene in charged political and social debates of our times around the globe? And do we want it to? And we invite all of you who are here and who are there, wherever you may be, we'll have a big tent here, to also consider these questions in your comments and interventions as we move along. But to be honest, I'm never quite sure whether scholars actually use the prompt that we write in preparing their remarks. So I also thought it might be interesting to ask the same set of questions to chatbot GPT, and to see what artificial intelligence might have to say on the matter. And to be perfectly frank, I ended up asking chatbot to write my introductory remarks for me. Now, I wish that I could say that the last several minutes of remarks is what chatbot produced, but that isn't the case. And it turns out in comparing the answers to the prompt and my answers to the request to write my introduction for me, chatbot's much better with genres than with questions. And it did produce a perfectly plausible introduction to this conference, and I do want to read it to you for a sort of perverse pleasure. But this is how chatbot would have begun this conference. Welcome to the Conference on Digital History. Today we gather to explore the intersection of history and technology, and to reflect on the ways in which digital tools are transforming the field of historical research. Digital history has opened up new possibilities for understanding the past, enabling historians to analyze large amounts of data, visualize historical trends and patterns, and create interactive and multimedia experiences that engage students and the public in new ways. However, as the use of digital tools in historical research continues to evolve, it is important to engage in critical reflection on the ways in which these tools can both enable and limit our understanding of the past. We must consider how digital history can be used to challenge traditional historical narratives and to uncover previously hidden perspectives and voices. We hope that this conference will inspire new ideas, spark innovative collaborations, and help to advance the field of digital history into exciting and meaningful ways. So it's pretty good, huh? I mean, it's uncannily familiar, it's pretty vacuous. You know, it's a perfect opening to a conference. It's probably a lot like the part I wrote before it. But chatbot's answer to the prompt, rather than the introduction of the conference, is what interested me more. In part, because it professed to have trouble answering the question. The first thing it told me is that as an AI language model, I do not have personal reflections or opinions, but I can provide some insights and suggestions on how digital tools can change the way we research, write, and teach history. So first, yes, it's true. I wasted an enormous amount of time with Chatbot in preparing this introduction, but bear with me as we go along, because when I put the prompt in as a paragraph filled with a series of questions, as I did to the presenters, I received a very different response from when I entered each question individually. It went in sort of just different directions. Now, I won't go through all of them, and you guys could all go try and do this exercise yourself. I think it answers different questions than we want to, but I do want to sort of give you a couple of Chatbot's responses to our questions. And so you'll recognize them from the prompt that I said earlier. So one is that in order to encourage historians to think of digital methods as a radical critique, rather than simply as efficient storage and mapping, resources and support are needed to ensure that scholars are trained in the use of these tools and are able to integrate them into their research and teaching practices. This might involve developing new courses, workshops, and training programs that focus on digital methods, as well as providing access to the necessary tools and technologies. Fair enough. Another response, to institutionalize digital history as critique, it will be important to establish a robust scholarly community around the field. This might involve developing new journals, conferences, and professional associations that are dedicated to digital history and that foster collaboration, innovation, and critical reflection. So, on the one hand, in hearing or reading these statements, they feel very much like ones we would receive in promotional materials from our respective academic institutions. But on the other, they also reveal one aspect of digital history that I hope we will take up over the course of these 2 days. In my original correspondence with the contributors to the theme issue, I noted that I have discomfort with the term digital history because of the way it functions as an empty signifier. And actually, in going over my past emails, I realized that Stephen Robertson asked me to clarify what I meant by that, but then under an avalanche of other emails, I never did, so I'll try and do so today, belatedly and with apologies. And I think that the Chatbot response to my prompt reveals what I mean, insofar as we are provided with a field of study, a call for new courses, the need for resources to do the work, even the creation of a new professional association, but we are not provided with the definition of what this field is or what exactly it's supposed to do. It's almost as if the content of this new digital history is something to be deferred to a later date, at which point it will be determined. What it is now is something to be decided later. Certainly the variety of topics and concerns addressed in the theme issue speak to the different forms that digital history might take and the differing theoretical, methodological, and practical questions we need to answer. If you want to think of the empty signifier issue, you could think about the ways the different contributors to the volume have addressed different problems under the same umbrella in ways that, if they weren't all put together, simply wouldn't talk to each other. And I think one of the big challenges for really doing the hard work of deciding what this is, if it isn't just history with a digital added to it, if there's something new and innovative about it, it's got to be about bringing all these different parts of it together to get us together to debate this out, to hammer it out. I mean, we have lots of different questions on the table here today. We have questions of source and text, as in Jesse Torgerson's contribution, or Laura Moriali's, issues of how the computer can be marshaled to alter history and do it now, as in Stephen Robertson's. Marnie Hughes-Warrington wonders about the possibility of artificial intelligence and algorithmic logic and patterns as a new sort of history. Silke Schwanz has a call to imagine interactive scenarios. Christian Wachter is interested in hypertext. Shazad Bashir actually offers a concrete example of history written in a radically different form. I have no idea what Gary Shaw is going to do. It's a mystery black box to me, but I'm excited to find out. The point is that digital history, or maybe digital humanities, or maybe digital scholarship, it spirals out again, is a very loose epistemological web of intersecting possibilities. And the goal of this conference is to establish more robust connections between these points, to start filling in the blanks, as it were, signifying the signifier. But the trick is to do it without arresting the dynamism or the play, which this kind of looseness has allowed, and I hope will continue to allow. So I'm hoping this leads us to advances in both theory and practice of history, which is a very chatbot-sounding line. But by this I mean both what history is, or perhaps will be in the future, and how we produce these histories. So I'd like to return to my conversation with Chatbot to offer some thoughts on the former, what history is or will be in the future, before returning to the more practical issue of producing those histories, of making them, actually getting them into production. So, as you can tell, Chatbot and I are very good friends now. We've had a lot of conversations. Some of them have been quite long and meaningful, others less so. And I did ask Chatbot whether it could write history. And it told me it can't, that it can't write history. That's something it cannot do. So then I asked if it has awareness of its past. And this is the response that Chatbot gave me. Now, Chatbot is an artificial intelligence language model developed by OpenAI, and as an AI model, it does not have consciousness or awareness of its own past or experiences. Chatbot is programmed to generate responses to input based on patterns and probabilities derived from a large data set of human language, but it does not have the ability to reflect on its own experiences or memories in the way that human beings can. Chatbot's memory, en guillemets, in quotation marks, is based on its training data set, which contains a vast amount of text data from various sources. It can use this data to generate responses that may reference past events or knowledge, but it does not have a personal or subjective experience of those events. The responses generated by Chatbot are based solely on the patterns and probabilities that are derived from the input data, and it does not have a personal or subjective perspective on those patterns. In short, while Chatbot has access to a vast amount of text data that it can use to generate responses that may reference past events or knowledge, it does not have consciousness or awareness of its own past or experiences. It turns out that Chatbot is the ideal Ronchian historian, whose responses are based solely on the patterns and probabilities that are derived from the input data, but does not have a personal or subjective perspective on those patterns. This is Peter Novick's noble dream of objectivity enacted. So we could ask ourselves, is Chatbot actually the historian's ideal? Maybe, but when I asked Chatbot to write my biography, it told me I was born in 1950 in New York, neither of those things are true, and that I'm currently the president of the Center for Jewish History. And I had no idea that I was that, and if I am, it's certainly an unpaid position. Anyhow, it was just riddled with inaccuracies and fabrications. Maybe I can't call them fabrications. It's very unclear why. It seems like that would be the low-hanging fruit of Chatbot, just going and, go to my Wikipedia page or something. So what kind of historian this is, it's up. It's up for grabs. But there's another aspect worth considering. Because this model by which Chatbot produces its predictive answers is an analysis of past patterns of data. So while Chatbot claims that it does not have awareness of a past, it certainly uses the past to predict the future, or at least in most of its cases to predict the future, perhaps in not its writings about the past. What's really interesting about this is, of course, whether or not such a relationship to the past, using the past, mining the past, marshaling the past to then generate something that we can use now, constitutes some sort of history. It's an open question. It's actually one that Marnie Hughes-Warrington pursues in her article for the theme issue. Personally, I started to keep thinking and rehearsing the idea that this is some sort of return to Historia Magistra Vitae, the past as life's teacher 2.0, Stefan, as it were, in this weird and warped way. That's probably something more for the historical futures section of history and theory than our conference today, but it's one that I keep coming back to in this generators of history, authors of history, co-authors of history. But to pivot back to more practical concerns, to move away, because I could sit and have a cognac and talk with Chatbot for hours. I want to again signal really the importance and significance of holding the conference here in partnership with Brown University Library, because I believe the library may very well become the site of future academic production, as well as retention and dissemination of scholarship. And Brown University is on the forefront of this endeavor through their digital publication project in collaboration with the Mellon Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities. You know, one structural problem facing digital history that we'll likely discuss has been a very top-down model where the tools to do digital history are sort of dropped down onto a particular scholar rather than these tools being built to address the particular intellectual projects investigated by those scholars. So the integration of fields of scholarship with technical designers to create a more bespoke fitting of intellectual pursuit with intellectual production is actually seen in the finished products published through the Brown University Digital Publications Project. They're doing that work, and I think that's important work that's going to carry us into the future. And you know, one thing I keep thinking about is whether that's where publications should happen. And to take this a step further, I'd like to put this in conversation with a shift occurring in academic publication and publishing brought on by increased implementation of open access. Now, this is my view, but to my mind, the majority of the discussion about open access has been overly focused on the reception side. This is how to make scholarship available to as wide an audience as possible, and the opportunities afforded by the digital are a key part of this. It's certainly a very important part of the conversation. But as the partnership between Brown, Mellon, the NEH, and presses such as MIT demonstrate, we really also need to focus on this production side and think about the production side. These are the structures and costs required to produce high-level academic scholarship, be it in the traditional analog mode or via the creation of new digital strategies. And as the editor of a journal, I'm very much aware of the time, cost, and effort it takes to produce such high-level scholarship. And I'll restrict what follows to some comments about publishing academic journals, though perhaps this is something that could be teased out or extended to academic publishing in general. Traditional publishing houses like Elsevier, Taylor and Francis, or Wiley, my own beloved Wiley, who publishes History and Theory, they've seized on this moment to provide more open access articles, which is surely a good thing, but this comes at an upfront cost, paid at times by governments, by universities, or by private individuals. And it's a worrying trend as journals are now incentivized to publish more, which may very well lead to a decrease in selectivity. This, of course, to increase short-term profits, while questions of access to publication are raised for those who do not have the resources to pay and thus unlock open access for their publications. It really is an ethical dilemma on both ends, both in terms of who can publish open access and what the money attached to it does to the journals who are publishing. One idea I'd like to float, this is just a pie in the sky, is that journals such as History and Theory collaborate with libraries such as Brown, creating consortiums of journals, each subsidized by their home institution or society, and disseminated by a library or libraries to allow open access to their materials. So in theory, if enough journals and institutions participate, then the cost for an individual institution subsidizing one journal would be offset by the reduced library cost of buying bundled subscriptions from large publishing conglomerates. The open access enabled by the arrangement should drastically reduce library budgets, in theory. Now, this is something of a prisoner's dilemma, because it would require buy-in from enough institutions and enough journals for the economic benefit to work. And it's also the case that the universities or societies that subsidize these journals would in fact be giving the material away to those universities or colleges that cannot afford to do so, or simply do not run a scholarly journal, or the dude on the street who wants to read the article. The trick will be to convince those in power that the total open access to such scholarship is truly a greater good, and the economic advantages are sufficient to pursue it. And this is where forward-thinking project like Brown's digital publication initiative could take a leading role and place in transforming publishing, dissemination, and access. Of course, one must also walk in with eyes wide open, because tying the future of a journal to a large bureaucracy, such as a university, lacks the cold capitalist surety of a profit-driven model. We more or less know where we stand with supply and demand. The priorities of an academic institution, however, might shift or change at the whims of a president, provost, or group of regents, and this could lead to the shutting down of the host and the total deactivation of the project. I should also say that as a journal who benefits from the current publishing model, it's an enormous gamble. I understand this is in many ways a different issue from the one before us at this conference, but I also believe that for digital history to thrive, the structural environment needs to change, and these questions of publishing, publication, and dissemination will be key factors. So I hope that we can keep this on our minds, on our radar, as we think about the work to be done in digital history and digital scholarship. So how are we going to do this work? Well, this is a sort of mode d'emploi, a little instruction manual. Over the next 2 days, our goal is in many ways to place the problem of intractable structural impediments and restrictions to the side. We're not going to wring our hands about if only we could do this. Instead, hopefully, we're going to think about those things that we want to do and how we can do them. Each presenter will provide a 15-minute talk or provocation, after which the moderator will put the presenters in brief conversation, and then crucially will open to the audience for the final portion of the session. The idea is for the conversation to be generative, for the audience to be active interlocutors. And on that note, I want to say we do have a pretty robust online audience, as well as our robust in-person audience. And so we're going to do our best to include everyone in the conversation, and we'll ask for your patience with that as we work through the different people having different questions. So without further ado, let's start our session on digital history and theory. Thank you for your patience listening to the remark. I'm going to ask Stephen and Stefan to come up. I'll shift my mode from talker to moderator, and let's get this conference started. Thank you.
I don't care. I could just sit on the table, too. I don't need to be here.
I don't think you would do that. Would you?
Sure I would.
Okay. That's right. More Ethan. 1, 2. Can you hear me? Maybe not. Yeah. All right. So, changing my hat. This is great because we get to go right into the heart of the matter, and I'm pleased and excited that we're going to start out this first panel with Stefan Tanaka and Stephen Robertson. I should say there are fuller biographies at the conference website. For the sake of time, I'll just some highlights of their biography. They will present in order, and then we'll move into conversation. But I do want to say we're really lucky to have them both here because they've been working on these issues around digital history, digital databases, archives for some time, and made some of the most important early pronouncements on it, but they didn't stop there. They've been really active and important discussants all the way through. So it's really great for us, lucky for us to have them both here. So I'll start with Stefan Tanaka, who's professor of communication at the University of California, San Diego. He's a scholar of the uses of the past and of time in the writing of history, mostly modern Japan, although certainly he can talk about time in almost any context, as it turns out. His book, Japan's Orient, Rendering Past into History, which examines the reconfiguration of Japan's past to reconfigure Japan's relation with Asia during the early 20th century, has become a classic in the field, one of the most important works in the field. It must feel pretty cool to be a person who has that.
To be labeled classical.
Well, we can talk about that later, too. His recent book, History Without Chronology, which is open access, brings out the historicity of the linear and homogeneizing structures of history itself. He's written extensively on problems of time and history, and has worked on new media, historical narrative, and with the Force 11 community to foster new and crucially open modes of scholarly communication. And then we have Stephen Robertson. He's professor in the Department of History and Art History at George Mason University, where from 2013 to 2019, he served as executive director of the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media. You couldn't get better credentials than that, to call. He's an historian of the 20th century, and his research and teaching focus on crime and surveillance, African-American urban history, and digital history. And I do want to highlight that with colleagues at the University of Sydney, he created the award-winning Digital Harlem, a research tool that maps the complexity of everyday life in the 1920s. He's currently completing an online publication, Harlem in Disorder, a spatial history of how racial violence changed in 1935, under contract with Stanford University Press. So Stefan will be presenting History as Communication Part 2, followed by Stephen presenting History Unbound, from book discipline to digital discipline. So let's welcome Stefan first. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm sure my voice projects enough, but does the
We need it
recording pick it up?
Yeah, we need it for online.
Is it okay right here? Okay, good. Thank you. I feel more like a charlatan now after that introduction. I mean, I've been dabbling and trying to get engaged into what I started as the digital humanities, and I consider my work really a failure. But it's been a productive failure because it led to a work like History Without Chronology, which it starts from a simple question of, well, why do we have to write linearly when in computers you can chain things together and connect things in all sorts of different ways. So it's been very productive, and I continued to do it. And more recently, I became an advocate for open source, open access publications. And I'll say that when you say long, I mean, my reaction to that, it's an increasingly frustrating endeavor. And I admire people like Stephen who work with it and build it in various ways. My study in my work in the digital now is seeing the digital as basically a normative form of communication. And so my engagement in the digital history is more, where is digital media taking, or what is the potential of digital media for history? And so, as a snapshot, the digital challenges history. It forces, I still go back to Jerome McGann's work. The digital makes you, it exposes every jot and tittle of your inconsistencies. And so basically, the digital exposes our assumptions that have become normalized, but in the digital world, they might not work, or there might be other ways of doing it. So the digital forces us to reevaluate our structures and assumptions. And it doesn't mean that we have to change them, but we have to reevaluate them and see if they're apposite for the ways we communicate today. And with ChatGPT, I have to stop these asides. But with ChatGPT, I mean, I just had my students write something with it, but then we talked about it rather than pretended who was doing it. And I think then by doing that, we could think of history as a discipline. For me, it's more of a media, but a way to address some of the challenges that social media is bringing to how we learn, how we know, and how we interact. And I'll get to that in a little bit. This is from Sam Weinberg, who just kind of talks about the potential of history. Sam Weinberg, I'll bring him up again later, but Sam Weinberg is a psychologist of learning who studies history teaching and history learning. But this is, in some ways, I think a good ambition, is to think about how history, not how we make a history alive, but history becomes, and the historical thinking becomes foundational to how people interact and know. Oops, wrong one. So where I'll start is, this was in my piece in the theme issue, but this is the way that I think the digital challenges history. On the left, The Age of Ancestors, Authors, and Friends is from Alan Liu and Friending the Past. And on the right, it's from John Miles Foley, Oral Traditions in the Internet. And it is kind of a typical linear development of communications, right? From the oral to the textual to the digital. But when you read their work, you find that the oral and the digital are more similar, and the textual is the outlier. In other words, recursivity is part of the operation of movement, transformation. And the other one is that the textual is the outlier. In other words, our world, our knowledge system is the outlier over, say, a 2,000-year history, or not a history, but period of how humans have recorded the past and used that past. And this is the famous Socrates quote. And what I'll just highlight is he complains that without the oral and with the textual, students become wise in their own opinion instead of wise. And the preface to that is they're hard to be with. This strikes me as the increasing fragmentation and isolation and dogmatism of all different approaches of the internet age today. And that's a way of suggesting the similarities between Socrates and the digital. Now, I don't want to go too far on this, but again, it just kind of shows the outliers of the textual. I'm not saying the textual is unimportant, but we have to think about the affordances of the textual. And as I was preparing this, the AHA and the council made a new declaration yet again. They argued that in order to foster digital history, digital scholarship, and I actually agree with what they're trying to do. And they emphasize new knowledge, or de-emphasize new knowledge, and emphasize increase and diffusion of knowledge. And what that does, though, is that it changes history from a knowledge system to a communication system. But then if you think about that, then it upsets the whole kind of flow of historical work. So if you think of the flow of historical work, I like using Claude Shannon's, I can't understand the article, but I like using Claude Shannon's mathematical theory of communication, because this is the beginning of computerization of knowledge. And so he comes up with what in communication is called the conduit model of transmission. And so here, he sees this as a very mechanical form through which computers are used to calculate and send a message. But you could change this to information source, fact, documents, transmitter, historian, researcher. I'll come back to noise. Receiver, publisher. Destination, reader. And the only thing that upsets this would be variability, perspective, sensibility. And we use peer review to make sure there's not very much noise in the system. A very knowledge-based system, a very hierarchical system, that I would argue has been extremely effective in bringing us to where we are today. And I'm not arguing that it's going to go away, but that's part of the thing that's under pressure, and I think presses have been brilliant in ensuring their survival despite some of the changes that have come along. That's my conclusion. But then I asked this question, kind of riffing on Alida Ausman's, is time out of joint? In other words, we have a digital communication system that has certain kinds of affordances, and we have a history communication system with a different set of ways of doing things. So my inspiration for this then is so much of what my historical work is from Michel de Certeau. And this is from his Mystic Fables. And the part that I want to emphasize here is the attempt to reorganize places for people to communicate. But again, the parallel that I see with our digital age is that the mystics are engaged in a worry about the breakdown of a hierarchical system that had held the world together, which was the church, and to find out a way to maintain some sense of order prior to science and rationality. And so then, I would argue then we have to ask the question instead, what do pasts do? And Certeau then comes up with a very elegant statement. I mean, when you read Certeau, I mean, you have to dedicate time to reading him, but it's to historicize our research and dehistoricize our subjects. So in other words, we have to historicize our frameworks and how we think, basically the conduit model of communication, and recognize that our objects of study are surrounded by various kinds of pre-established forms of knowledge that limit them in certain ways, and we could only address them in certain kinds of ways. And we've been talking about, for example, I just wrote about the Orient and Orientalism, and I still use that word, mainly because that's what it is. I mean, it's the behind of the West. And now we call it Asia, but when you read the stuff, Asian studies still follows that kind of model. That's part of the reasons why I'm not a friend there anymore. So when we think about what this, okay, the past do is that we're trying to think about this historicization of research and the dehistoricization of subjects. So the way that I go about it, or I want to suggest here, is that comics is a wonderful way to think about and work through these kinds of ideas. These are some of my favorite comics. And I'll talk a little bit, or I'll show some images from Barefoot Gen, which is about Hiroshima and the bombing. And Showa is Mizuki Shigeru, who's one of the most famous manga artists in Japan, passed away a decade ago. The significance of comics then, this is from Henry Jenkins talking about comics, and the significance of is that this is how comics put pressure on history. The mise-en-scene changes time and space, or Newtonian time and space, to time spaces, and that's the mise-en-scene. So these are not kind of times and spaces, but the activity at the moment. The everyday relocates the historical subject to the activity of individuals rather than the stuff of nations and institutions. Motion. Motion can be recursive, it can be repetition, it can be homeostasis. And it can be linearity as well. We should not presume that motion is linear. And then the relation with the past. And here, to me, the relation with the past is the potential for going to, not to basically the past as plural rather than the past as singular. And hopefully that'll come through in the following. The important part about comics, or that why I think it's important, is that it inverts the historical process. You go from the simplistic, the visual, the iconic, and basically for Hilary Shute, the comic is a documentary or witnessing. In other words, you go from the document or the activity to the historical or to the interpretation. But what you're doing is you're placing the visual into what people are doing rather than the institutions that are governing or claim to represent people. The other part about this is that reading a comic then, or so, in that sense, the creation of comic is reductive, but reduction leads to an amplification of points through the simplification rather than simplification as a lack of complexity. Okay. Then the other part of comics is that reading is additive. By additive then, the reader must contribute to the reading of the comic, either by filling in what does that iconic face represent? Who is that in that iconic face? What happens in the gutter in between? How do you fill in the motion that happens? And by doing that, all of a sudden, the multiple paths of the readers, of the activities in the comic, come to bear. The past is not singular, but everybody brings a different past to the reading. And to think about that, as compared to Claude Shannon, I bring up basically second-order cybernetics. But there's a very simple transformation here. One is that in cybernetics, there's a feedback system that changes the linearity. But inside the box, the observers are part of the activity system, not separate from. The observer is not independent of the activity system. Now, so what does that mean for history? The observer can be the recorder of the document. The observer can be the bystanders, the observer can be the researcher, the historian who writes it up, the reader, and history itself. So in other words, there's all sorts of different agents in the production of the reading in this case. Okay.
So somehow we got to wrap it up.
Yeah. Time and space, and this is basically the mise-en-scene. This is a scene from Hidashida, Barefoot Gen. The thing about reading then, or the reading about comics, is that in psychology in different fields, literature through Bakhtin, people have known that the readers contribute to the knowledge. The reader has to be a part of the knowledge system. And so, I mean, this is where historians have to bring in the current research from other fields. And one of those that I think is important then, if you think about the reading, then reading, and this is from Marianne Wolf, who writes about reading. She talks about biliteracy as digital reading, and she's thinking about literature, deep reading, but here I'm changing deep reading into the reading of the comic. And the reading of the comic, the deep reading is that you see through characters, you become another, you understand perspectives, and there's empathy. So the comic then allows you to get into and be part of the comic itself. So then, in this sense, the author are authors. The readers are co-producing the knowledge system that the comic book artist allows for. different ways to think about, I mean, Jesse's going to talk about CAPTA and data as basically captured, in other words, to bring in these are different ways to think about bringing in the human into the activities of an historian. To me, this is a wonderful example of the power of a comic. This is the end of Mizuki Shigeru's History of Showa. It's a very glossy, and most of it's in black and white, very glossy picture of Shinjuku, at that time one of the most modern cityscapes in Tokyo. And up in the top, you see there's this other, the phrase, the post-war economic miracle expands until Japan is one of the wealthiest countries on the earth. Why is people are not happy? That questions all of modern Japanese history, basically. It turns it back to, well, what's going on? So what you're doing is, through the comic, you think, oh my gosh, everything I thought I knew is questioned by this one image with the word. And so this is where the visual verbal combine to raise questions that one or the other cannot really do. And then I'm out of time. So what I'll do is stop here, is that there's a comic, there are two comics, and one way to do this is UC Merced, the Center for Humanities, had a project kind of providing, asking RFPs for scholars to make proposals of what their research or an idea to produce a comic. And a lot of times they use students to do this. And there's some really talented students, though. And these are two of my favorites. I mean, I can't bring them up here, but it's kind of the affordances of a comic, and especially how to read an Aztec common, shows the multiple temporalities from the, helps when you know what you're doing.
But we still got to wrap up.
I'm wrapped up.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I wanted to go down here. And how do you read a comic? You start in the upper left, right? Well, it tells you you can't start there. So all of a sudden, you have to follow this down. So this is very much the now. You follow it down, and so you start here, and it's a backward Z. And so you're learning how to read the comic, but at the same time you're learning to read the comic, there's an interpretation here, and part of this is that this image, which has been normally interpreted as Aztecs are violent people, because of the baby dying, you see this as infanticide, or has been interpreted as infanticide, is shown to be a very different process of dealing with a stillbirth. And then it's also connected to tamales at the same time. So it's both fun, serious, and instructional all at the same time in what, 3 or 5 pages. So I think the potential of the comic, but the potential in comics for teaching us differently how to think historically, as well as other ways to use media to expand history, is very, in my mind, is very rich. Thank you very much.
Excellent. All right. A slick exchange of slide decks. So we're going to change gear a little bit here, because I think very differently than Stefan, notwithstanding the possibility of confusing our names, which has already been invoked here. But given that I haven't read either what he or Jesse was going to say, there are some familiar characters in this talk that have already been introduced to us today that I think are potentially interesting to have already appeared in multiple people's perspectives. So, my article examined digital history largely on its own terms, rather than in relation to the discipline as a whole. In charting the uneven development of digital history and the extent to which it recreated existing forms, I pointed to data-driven arguments being published by Stanford University Press as a step towards the combination of the two properties of computers: their ability to process data and to provide an interactive and immersive environment. After teaching a graduate course about digital scholarship last fall and having the opportunity to read the other contributions to the thematic issue, particularly the article by Shahid Bashir and the review by Christian Wachter, I have come to think about long-form digital publications as having broader implications of the kind that we were asked to think about today. They do not just point towards forms of digital history that exploit the distinctive capacities of the computer. They also point to how the digital medium offers opportunities to develop new forms of historical argument not derived from digital methods. They make clear, in other words, that the future of history is not as a book discipline, but as a digital discipline. I'd imagine my digital scholarship course as a course for digital historians, as exploring forms for digital history. That initial approach grew from my work with Lincoln Mullen on argument-driven digital history, which had focused on how to fit short-form digital arguments to the article form, to print. As that project progressed, we were pushed by other digital historians to recognise the implicit arguments in a variety of digital forms of scholarship, to recognise that in the digital medium, arguments could take different forms than in print. At the same time, our own projects made clear that long-form digital arguments could not be fitted to print books to the same extent as short-form arguments could be to articles. Digital argument is inclusive rather than selective in both its evidence and its form, using digital methods to analyse data results in arguments that are more expansive, larger in scale than fit a book. The data required by digital methods produce multiple intertwined threads of interpretation and argument, beginning with the process of creating data from sources, extending to aggregations and analysis of that data at shifting scales and in various relations and contexts, and including data that does not fit a given argument. Such a digital argument would have been reduced in scale and complexity to fit a print book. Alternative is obviously to present digital argument in its native medium, in forms that make use of the features of the digital medium. During the approval process for the digital scholarship course, the History Department's graduate director gently encouraged me to make the course relevant to students not doing digital history, which involved focusing on the forms of argument the digital medium allowed rather than the forms that digital methods required, as I had in my article. The reorientation involved not charting new approaches so much as returning to the writings of the first digital historians of the internet age in the 1990s and early 2000s, which focused on the digital medium created by computers, not their ability to process data. In the hypertext history that they conceived, argument took the form of multiple threads linked together and presented simultaneously, not non-linear, but multilinear, with the evidence directly available rather than limited to selected quotations and citations, and thus not subordinated to a single interpretation. That's the original American hypertext history issue that Roy Rosenzweig edited, and Ed Ayres and Will Thomas's spectacularly unsuccessfully received article in the American Historical Review. As both Shahid Bashir and Christian Wachter point out in their history and theory articles, what this approach offered was forms to express concepts and the ways that historians interpret evidence difficult to express in traditional print forms. While Edward Ayres and William Thomas promoted a prismatic model for such an argument in line with the form of their 2003 article, The Difference of Slavery Made, which is up there, it has been a structure of layers proposed by Robert Darnton in 1999 that has been more widely pursued. In part, the appeal of that concept is that layers are less of a departure from the print form of argument and therefore more accessible to historians reluctant to read argument in any other form than a strictly linear progression. Examples of layered argument are found among the historical scholarship in the Stanford University Press Digital Project series I highlighted in my article. Although those projects employ digital methods, the forms of their arguments and how they relate argument and evidence are not contingent on the use of such methods. So they provide models for digital scholarship to be reimagined more broadly. And now the remote control won't work. Nor will the laptop. And I need these slides. remote control works again. In Layered Lives, Taylor Arnold, Courtney Rivard and Lauren Tilton label the sections of their argument layers rather than chapters to highlight the modular nature of the argument and the method. In America's Public Bible, Lincoln Mullen adopts a layered form that fits the form and process of his argument, namely identifying, visualising and studying quotations in American newspapers. At the base is a data set of millions of biblical quotations that appeared in newspapers, a selection of which are aggregated into trend lines showing the appearance of a verse over time. In another layer, two narrative layers offer interpretations of that data, verse histories for a selection of the data, and essays on broader questions in the history of the Bible in the United States. My own layered argument, Harlem in Disorder, created using the free open source Scalar platform, follows the same general form of layers of data, aggregate and narrative. However, as my information on events and prosecutions are drawn from multiple sources, the data is presented as a set of pages that each provide narrative descriptions of the interpretive choices made in creating data about an event. Another layer of pages aggregates those individual events into categories, with pages for types of violence, stages and outcomes in the legal process, and the activities and reporting of the mayor's investigation. This form both fits the arguments about scale of the project's spatial analysis and addresses the need to make visible the interpretive process of historical scholarship, also raised in Jesse Torkelson's and Silke Swant's articles in History and Theory. As Wachter highlights, layers are also invoked in Bashir's History and Theory article in regard to the interface of his digital book, A New Vision for Islamic Pasts and Futures, to highlight that it presents both a sequential and non-sequential paths for the reader. However, the form of the book offers another model for digital argument, one in which multiple narratives are represented as a network, with lines linking sections of chapters to highlight non-sequential paths through the content. Bashir also shapes the form of his argument to shift the relationship between text and visual evidence, taking advantage of the ability to present and manipulate images in the digital medium to make that visual evidence not just more available, but able to interrupt, adjudicate, and even challenge the argument. As Wachter highlights, the interface offered by the Scalar platform used for bodies and structures echoes what Bashir and his collaborators created in a bespoke platform. The Bodies and Structures website, like Bashir's publication, still includes a table of contents, but also uses a Scalar feature called Paths to offer additional sequences of pages drawn from different sections of the text, as well as several of the visualizations available in Scalar, including network diagrams that map connections between pages designated as tags, and grid visualizations that also show additional relationships, such as notes and media. Another Scalar project, Messino Riva's Shadow Plays, Virtual Realities in an Analog World, a collaboration with our hosts here at the Brown University Library, uses the platform to shift the balance between text and visual, as Bashir does. It can be read following the table of contents, chapter by chapter, looking at each embedded simulation designed to illustrate the chapter's argument in turn, or by going directly to the simulations. The weight of the argument is carried by the visual component. I'm directing attention to layers and networks as shared ways of conceiving new forms of argument, and Scalar as a platform creating them, in part to temper Bashir's argument that digital books should be approached such that interfaces have to be designed anew constantly, with an eye towards the needs of authors wishing to make specific arguments. That could be read as suggesting that each project must necessarily start from scratch, requiring labour and resources that create a disincentive to pursue publication in the digital medium. Scalar eases those demands, providing an existing means to create a variety of different forms of argument. In this venue, I'm preaching to the converted somewhat, I think, given that the NEH workshop to support Born Digital Scholarship Publishing, organised by our hosts at the Brown Library, showcased Scalar alongside WordPress and Manifold as platforms for publication. While Manifold does not offer the same possibilities for developing new forms of argument that Scalar does, due to the extent to which it limits its users to the form of a book, the platform is worth noting as a reminder that the digital medium is not exclusive of print forms of argument. In other words, a move from book discipline to digital discipline would be an expansion of historical scholarship. Notwithstanding the charges that such an expansion represents a dilution of historical scholarship made by James Sweet, the president of the AHA in 2022, the AHA Council in January this year approved guidelines on broadening the definition of historical scholarship that support such a shift. Far more effectively than the earlier AHA guidelines for the professional evaluation of digital scholarship in history, which lent towards fitting digital scholarship to print models, the new guidelines provide a basis for doing history in ways that use the features of the digital medium. They take as a foundation that once calendars for assessing impact and modes of peer review are extended after publication, all historical scholarship can be subject to comparable evaluative criteria. 5 categories of evaluation are proposed: genre and dissemination, argument and documentation, impact and influence, current and future trajectory of the project, and collaboration. And more directly freeing understandings of scholarship from the book and article, those proposals create not just clearer recognition for digital history, but also for the scope for the wider use of the digital medium to change the way we do history. To take just one example, the third of the proposed categories, the current and future trajectory of the project, and recognising projects that represent ongoing scholarly research and genres that involve continuous revision and are iterative rather than terminal in form, has broader implications than the guideline discuss, including for the issues of preservation and sustainability that Laura Moriel raised in her History and Theory piece. The prevailing vision of scholarship as finished and fixed is tied to print, literally reflecting the result of putting it in print. In those terms, the dynamic nature of work in the digital medium has been seen as a bug. But outside that frame, it can be a feature of a way of doing history that enacts the long-standing understanding of scholarship as an ongoing conversation. In print, participants contribute and respond to other scholars in multiple different texts, disconnected from each other, and often appearing after a time lag that means that the conversation has changed. In the digital medium, an argument that can be expanded, updated, annotated, and linked to, and thereby incorporated in involving relationships with new and old scholarship, and by those means remain current in a way a print book cannot. Such a dynamic digital publication would also recast the preservation challenges that Moriel highlights, which come in part from requiring that publications in a digital medium be finished and made static in line with the form of a book. While funding tied to creating projects leaves such finished work without those avenues for support, it remains available to digital projects that continue to develop as part of scholarly conversation. So, to conclude, let me distill my reflections into the provocations and suggestions that the organisers requested from us. First, we need to unbind the form of historical argument from print. That requires not just recognition of more forms of scholarship, but the broad incorporation into our approach to conceptualising research of the question why this genre and mode of presentation are optimal for this project, which the new AHA guidelines currently pose only to those not writing books and articles. This change needs to extend to how we teach historical research. Second, we need to unbind the digital medium from print. We do not need to move historical scholarship online. It's already there, but anachronistically in print forms. Journals and increasingly monographs are delivered online as PDFs and in various ebook platforms that replicate the print page in both appearance and boundaries. I sat in on my department meeting this morning and heard that our library is going to be buying fewer digital primary source collections because they're repurposing their budget to buy more electronic editions of scholarly books. What we need to do is actually use the digital medium in which scholarship appears, trading PDFs for text presented on the web with links to other online content not bounded by the page. Finally, and most broadly, we need to unbind the future of scholarship from trying to preserve the future of the monograph and the existing structure of scholarly publishing. That response to the arrival of the digital has taken attention and energy better spent on exploring what forms historical argument can take in the new medium. The future of historical scholarship is not as a book discipline, but as a digital discipline in which some scholars use digital methods based on the capacity of computers to process data, but all scholars publish in the immersive and interactive medium that computers provide. A coda. Alas, the concern I expressed in my article about the future of opportunities for long-form scholarly digital publication has proved justified. Not long after the article was submitted, Stanford University Press announced that it had received its final round of funding from the Mellon Foundation, and to mark that, it would shut down digital projects when that funding ran out at the end of 2023. That leaves, by my reckoning, just one other Mellon-funded digital scholarly publishing initiative that's gone beyond digital monographs. Unfortunately, the remit of Brown University digital publication extends only to the faculty of its own institution. Perhaps it might be, needs to be, a model for an institutional shift in the publication of historical scholarship as it moves into the digital medium. Thank you. I guess we can leave that up as a tribute to our hosts.
Yeah, that's right. So I'll first get a pencil. Invite the panelists, Stefan and Stephen. If you want to engage with the other's talk, you're certainly welcome to, or we can open it up to the floor. I'll leave it your call.
No, I enjoyed that. I'll just speak personally. It's been so frustrating for me, especially as somebody who's been engaged in scholarly communication rather than digital history. These arguments in what you're talking about are, you make these arguments, and the librarians, you do things like at the AHA, and the audience is librarians. So we did something on publishing first books as open access. I think there were, and the panelists were assistant professors who just published their book. One has won a prize, by the way, a book prize. And most of the people in the audience were librarians. And the frustration is that we're in an industry of, in a sense, fear. And the fear is if we don't do the traditional things, then we're not going to keep a job. Or on the side of the presses, we have to figure out a way to monetize open access so we can maintain our profits system. And Wiley. So it's a very frustrating thing, and it takes, I just concluded we need mandates and carrots, and it's one by one person at a time. Sorry.
I think frustration is definitely part of the response to this. There's been, people have been raising this for a long time. I've come over time to think that we have to take more responsibility for this ourselves.
Absolutely.
And I put up the AQ special issue and Eden Wells' article. The problems in terms of the failure to build from that were created by historians, and by historians who refused, essentially, to try and read in a way that they had not read before. Part of my, those were non-linear pieces. They wanted to read them in a linear piece. Even the final form of Eden Wells' article is not what they wanted to produce. It's a compromise with the readers. Some of my optimism that we are slowly moving forward is that notion that people cannot read digital communication that is not strictly linear, I think is harder to make after another 30 years odd of experience with it. Now, there are still limits to that, but I think there is less traction for an argument that learning to read differently is an impossible hill to climb. I also think, unfortunately, that we're the responsible for the struggle to continue to recognise the scholarship. I remember early on when I was full of vim and vigour about everybody else being responsible for this in a meeting with the provost at Mason, and he kind of looked at me and said, that's up to you. You define what's scholarship in your field. I'm not defining what's scholarship in your field. And I kind of sat there and thought, shit, he's right. This is our fault. we have the power to define this. And in some ways, that's why I see some power in the second set of guidelines that the AHA put out. Their first set of guidelines on digital scholarship, I think, were fundamentally useless.
Is it
Because
the
they were
2015 one?
yeah,
Yeah.
because they were not willing to actually mandate in any way. They were not willing to kind of stake out some ground. They just said this is a conversation that should be had. The new guidelines, I think, are interestingly a step beyond that in that they're fundamentally endorsing post-publication peer review, which is the fundamental mechanical micro step from what we do now that would allow us to bring in a whole lot more scholarship. And they basically just kind of set that down as a foundation and said, on the basis that we can do that, this is what is going to happen. And so I think that kind of sense that this is a legitimate form of evaluation, as small a step as it is in the longer frustrations, is nonetheless a stronger statement by the AHA, and a statement that they made while their president was directly contradicting that position, and I give them more credit for that too.
So maybe we'll open it up to the audience.
I see that as scared.
Thank you. I just want to ask a couple of clarifying questions, mostly to Stefan, but feel free, of course, to reply. One argument was that digital history is innovating in not being linear. Now, in historiography, we have two meanings of linearity. First, there is temporal linearity, one thing after another. So in that respect, medieval annals were perfectly linear, 1 year after another. But then arguably, as Arthur Dante put it, talking about narrative sentences, whenever I say a sentence like the First World War started in 1914 with the assassination of the Archduke, I'm referring at least to two temporal spaces at the same time, to what happened in 1914 to the assassination of the Archduke, and to all those years of war until 1919, and I'm doing that at the same time. Now, of course, Dante writing in the early 60s couldn't have used the expression hypertext, but he's referring to he's analyzing normal historiographic sentences as being nonlinear in that respect. Secondly, we use nonlinearity as causal. That is, big causes have big effects. So Marxist historiography is usually perfectly linear. So if the United States and Soviet Union joined the Second World War, Germany was doomed, well, big causes had big effect. But if I talk about something totally small that was nobody noticed at the time, like a certain corporal in the First World War developing crazy ideas, that's nonlinear. And again, that's something that we do find in normal historiography. We don't need, the digital historiography makes it easier, but it doesn't revolutionize things. And to top it all, I really liked your reference to Claude Shannon and the idea that historiography is a kind of information science. There's an event, the event sends signals are received in the present, the historian is interpreting them, and that's how we get historiography. Ranke's innovation was that even when the signals are unreliable, we can still work with them if there's more than one and they're independent. It's just like, you receive burgled a noise that is not clear to you, and then you say, can you please repeat that? And it's, again, not very clear, but they are consistent, so you get a meaning out of that. So Ranke, in a sense, was using that kind of information model without reading Claude Shannon or knowing the math and the rest of it. So again, what's new?
My question about linearity is on a framework of the use of time as if time is linear. And we use it as linear, but time is historical. And there are other ways to think about time and temporality. For me, I define time as an activity system. And the activity system then generates the metrics for what time should be. And I'll just say that our understanding of time and linearity is based upon physics. How can we apply a physical system of energy and masses to human activity, which is much more biological? Okay? So, I'm not denying that a certain level of linearity has always existed. I mean, people do things, and therefore you can see that as linear. But what do they do? And there's recursivity. I think that homeostasis is the basic condition of human society in organic systems, not progress and advancement. So the problem of linearity then is that it limits us to thinking about other ways of social organization and social communication. And I would argue that the comics then brings out the multiple ways that pass, interact in an activity system or in a communication system. And, Claude Shannon and Ronka do go together. But the problem with the digital, part of it is that the observer is not independent. And to me, that's empirically verifiable, even though we have a knowledge system where the observer is independent. And so I see the observer as changing the conditions at the same time that the observer is observing the conditions. It's a different notion of what process and change. You could call that linear, but there's recursivity as well as linearity and repetition all built in at the same time. So I would say that is new.
So
To me, it's a different epistemological system.
And we have a question from online, yes?
Yes, Chris Walker has a question.
Okay.
He's going to ask it himself.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, great. Thank you so much for both of your interesting and inspiring talks. I really liked both of them, and I always thought of the notion that Stephen Robertson stressed, like saying, how can we make the change happen now? And as far as I have understood him correctly, we should put the initiative in our own hands and make the change happen. The tools are there. The tools are available, and we should do it. But I would like to ask, isn't there also the problem or the challenge as digital history in general, also the analytic techniques of text mining and so on is facing, namely that we have to teach and train the students and also the trainers who are not socialized in digital techniques to make that change happen more, in a sense, getting away from the cultural techniques we are used to writing linear texts, something that we inherited from the generations before us, in order to create new forms of writing and doing new kinds of analytic research that is more in line with a new way of thinking and that is able to create a new set of cultural techniques to make that happen. So how do you think, or how would you tackle this problem of training the people who could actually make that change happen now?
Stefan just whispered that and I actually think he means more the centre I used to direct has been doing this for a long time. Look, there's a throwaway line in my talk about folding the new ways of thinking about argument into the way we teach, and that's true. I don't think that imagining new forms of argument is quite as hard to integrate in what we do as training text mining techniques are. The difference between maybe a fundamental way of thinking about historical practice and a particular method, and that's part of the distinction I was trying to draw, that digital forms of argument, digital forms of publication don't rely on digital method, and it's a way of thinking as much as a way of platforms. The other thing that I've been doing with Lincoln Mullen is providing models of this. So one of the outcomes of our argument-driven digital history work was a site of models of argument-driven digital history articles that are out there to encourage, and there's a site called Models of Argument-Driven Digital History that we did in conjunction with the Journal of Social History, funded by Mellon, who deserve a shout out for what they've done to make it possible for us to think about these things. Something concrete that people can use and teach. And I think, again, just imagining a model of an argument versus teaching text mining, I think is another way of recognising that this is possible to incorporate. We've had big arguments about whether you teach digital history methods in your normal methods course or you send it out to the margins, and in most places it's still out there on the margins and has not been allowed into the methods course. Thinking about the construction of argument would be much easier to integrate into the way we do things already without having to fight that fight again. So the models that, and again, that's what I think is important about the models I chose to highlight now. We don't have to do this from scratch. We don't have to do this in the abstract. We need to pull together the models we've got and use them to frame a way of teaching and encouraging people to do this and to ask the question. And again, I'm as cynical as most people in this room about the ability of the AHA to move the profession. But the set of guidelines they've just released, again, would provide support for changing the way we teach how we do history. And that notion of recognising far broader forms of historical scholarship is, again, a different kind of argument than an argument about method. It's an argument about a different part of what we do and teach that I think we can fundamentally move faster on. So again, like a lot of things, people are already doing this. Mellon funded NDH fellowships for digital publication. I got one to finish my project. They've funded a wave of those things to make this kind of thing happen. And the value of that kind of support outlasts the initiatives that publish it in some ways, because the work is out there, the models are out there, people can work with them and off them and build on them. And again, to return to what I said to Stefan, I have hope that we're in a different moment because the digital is so fundamental, I think, to the way we work, even if we're appallingly unself-conscious about that the argument that we need to think about publication in the broader sense as digital publication is somehow its time has kind of come. And I think it's very few departments would we find meaningful pushback to moving those forms of publication, those forms of argument, those broader forms of history into what we do than we would, in a way that we would still get to moving digital method in. So I think, parsing those two things apart was my provocation for trying to think about how to move things forward a bit.
So what's really interesting about that then is that at the same time that right now holding the assignation digital in your digital history seems to be essential in getting funding and often in getting lines for university, much of your argument is that the way forward is precisely a full integration of this in, and we're on a...
Well, see, I would disagree with it. I think that's a little bit out of date. I think if you want to find me a digital history job in the latest round of hires, for the last couple of years, they've been vanishingly few. I think that we've actually made quite a bit of progress over the last few years about bringing the digital back into disciplines, which is something that I wrote about 8 years ago as where we were going. I think the other way that I would point to that broader integration is something that I was talking about earlier on. The digital is now all through the NEH grant programs. We have an Office of Digital Humanities, but we also have digital publication grants. There are digital strands within the collaborative research program. There's digital within preservation and access. There's digital in public projects. There's digital in education. There's a sense in which the digital is available to us in all of the things we do, not under a marked digital flag. So I think that used to be the case. That's a moment. We've seen that moment with other fields. I don't think that's the moment we're in on all sorts of levels. And as somebody who chased funding, I can tell you that digital is not bringing funding from administrators in anything like the way it did 10 years ago. And even then, I think that was blowing small things into bigger things. That moment's gone, but I think we have benefited from that moment in the fact that the digital is now wired into some of our infrastructure, some of our funding infrastructure, some of our teaching infrastructure. So we do still do stuff under the flag of the digital, but I think actually we can find the digital in some other places in a way we couldn't 10 years ago.
Let's go to the...
And sorry, I'm being deliberately provocative.
No, that's good. Well, we can talk more about it later, because
I promise I'm not
there's many ways to skin this digital cat.
Thanks so much. I want to ask a question that comes up through a slightly different framing of digital history, which is to look at the history of the digital in the sense of what has happened in the digital. And it seems to me that in the history of the digital, there's been a kind of aesthetic failure of the digital humanities in a broad sense, and that it has failed to pick up and take over as many thought it would. And this strikes me as a story that is common in the history of the digital in the sense of this optimism, this techno-optimism, that then gets taken up in some sense, but in many ways fails. And the figure that I'm thinking of here is Ted Nelson, who is the inventor of the hyperlink. Ted Nelson has a famous story about how he invented the hyperlink. He's been here at Brown in the computer science department in various ways as well. But the way that the hyperlink actually picked up was through Google's use of it in the PageRank algorithm, right? This commoditized conception of it that managed to kind of skyrocket the web. So my question is, how do we, if we want to be optimistic about using the digital in history, how do we respond to this charge that in the history of the digital, this newness has often been commoditized and taken up in a certain way, where, which I think, to me, it seems like the digital humanities as a constellation is not immune from. It has a similar kind of history.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I got into this is making a silly comment like I just did to you, but getting it back and says, then do something, Stefan. And it was about, the commercialization is going to take over how we do our digital work, or basically publications. We have to make sure it serves our purpose, not the commercial purpose. Well, I mean, quite frankly, commercial organizations move a lot faster than history departments do. And where I would differ from your optimism is that the peer review within the department, the evaluation of the APM, nothing says book. It says major project. It doesn't even say print, it's just major project. It is the history department or whatever department is the one that defines it. So, how do you do it? To me, there's enough, you're right, there's enough room. I don't think we have enough support on a widespread basis. But there's enough room to do smart work that's either born digital or inflected by digital kind of sensibilities. There's really good work happening in the digital humanities about the hermeneutics of it and ways of thinking about it. But the flip side of that is that there's a lot of other stuff. But, so my reaction to that is be a scholar. Get the stuff that you think advances the field in the direction that you want to go, rather than to worry about the normative.
So not to curtail you, but I'm going to curtail you because I want to get one. We're running out of time, and I'd like to get the question from Wolf online before we end. But then, of course, we can continue the conversation during what's going to be a short break.
Yes, thank you very much for fascinating papers. I like to inquire into two key terms of the second presentation, the argument and immersion. I can appreciate the need to unbind argumentation from print. I wonder, does that also entail we have to unbind narration from print? Obviously it does. Or does that imply also perhaps that digital history is much more conducive to delivering professional historical arguments than to delivering professional historical narration, because the two modes in that sense are not identical? And in that sense also linked to immersion, what happens to the relationship, if that's true, let's say, digital history as we come to know it now is perhaps particularly good at delivering complicated arguments. What happens then to the relation between professional history and public history? Because I assume public history continues to be in need of convincing, compelling narration. And that's actually linked to the second question about immersion. I can appreciate that digital history has immersive qualities, especially for scholars, because they can immerse themselves into the archive immediately. But I think it's a different sense of immersion than the kind of immersion we are talking about when we're talking about popular digital media like video games. So in that sense, I would argue the argumentation in digital history, as interesting and attractive and immersive it might be for scholars, it does not have a particularly immersive quality for lay people. And therefore, again, it seems to widen the already wide gap between professional and public history. Thank you.
And I have absolutely no problem with that. The first and fundamental lesson I learned when I took over this Rosenzweig Centre was the importance of audience. You cannot produce something for everybody. And that's the first thing we have to dissuade people from when they do a digital project. Oh, look, I'm going to put my project online and then I will reach everybody. No, you will reach the people for whom you are producing the project. So professional history and public history are two different things with two different audiences and logically, therefore, two different forms. And refining what we do as professional historians doesn't preclude public history. And in the same way, you know, immersive public history and immersive professional history will be two different things. I mean, I think it's an absolute kind of way of muddying the waters to try and think that somehow digital history is this thing that's going to speak to every audience in exactly the same way. No. Physicists get to talk to each other as academic physicists. Why have historians never been comfortable with the idea that we can talk to other professional historians as professional historians? And if we want to talk to somebody else, then we produce a different kind of work for that audience. And American digital history started off as public history. And in a lot of ways, that has muddied people's sense of what's possible in the digital. If we talk to people outside the US about digital history, they have very different origin stories and they have none of that kind of confusion that we bring to American digital history, that it has to somehow be for the public. So I have no problem with that. Let's do better professional history and better public history using the digital and using that medium. It's all about audience. And audience require different things. We do it in different digital ways. I think that I have no problem with that, a little bit like Stefan has no problem with those other kinds of things. Let's do better what we're doing, and let's be comfortable that some of our audience can be each other, and some of our audience can be our students, and some of our audience can be the public. And let's do the things that they need instead of pretending they all want the same thing.
All right. Well, on that very positive and affirmative note, let's end this first panel. We'll thank our panelists. We'll take a short break.